Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy databases. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, Gulcin Jelinek, who is a staff database engineer at Xata. Gulcin joins us from Prague, Czech Republic. Gulcin Jelinek, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Robbie.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software and databases?
Right. I thought about it a little bit before I came to the podcast, and I really like to listen to your podcast. Gave me a lot of perspective with the other guests as well. So thank you for doing it. I think there are few aspects, of course, there are too many aspects perhaps to think about what makes something maintainable. And I like usually doing when there's a word, I first search it for etymology of it, what does maintain mean? Because I didn't learn, English as a native speaker. So for me, every word was learned. So when I look at it, maintainability, it kind of comes with repairing, right? Repairing something and technical. When you think about repairing in a technical space, what makes something easier to repair if it's something already kind of working good to start with. So it's something lean that you imagine that is kind of easier to maintain than something bulky, rusty, old, right? So this basic images that comes to mind. And I don't really have that much of development experience or legacy code bases in terms of code bases of software code. This is not something that I work so hard with, but I know legacy databases a lot. And so that gives me a perspective of how things should be actually maintained. I think the first thing that comes to my mind that how can a project onboard new people? And that also has lots of context that is involved with it. And one is that the documentation aspect of it. And especially when I started, many years ago, that was really overlooked aspect of something. Documentation was not even considered something an important thing. And then also when we say documentation, it's also huge. What type of documentation? What do we mean by that? And there is it can be code comments, right? When you are writing code, it can be the API documentation if you're the API. There's also the user aspect of it. The users will have the different version of the documentation. And if you want someone to actually join, that is, we talk the onboarding to somebody to the project, developers, how I involve a developer to the project, contributor to the project. So I think when you think of maintainability, you need to think of the persons, the people who will actually maintain this thing. And to be able to maintain those things, you need to give tools to those people to actually start with. And I think that's really important and probably not so well, it's kind of overlooked aspect of it. And maintaining the code base is one thing as well. And then also how we do the release of this project, how we do the deployment of it. So there are once you have this tool, product, whatever you call it, you have to also think about it, how I will actually develop things in this. So I need to add a new feature. If it's an old and complicated and kind of left alone piece of software, people will actually probably spend their most of time to understand stuff and try to not to break it rather than actually, come up with something, to invent something. Yeah, so these are all probably very high level in a way, but I think it's important. And if something is not usable, we don't need to repair it. So we need to make sure that whatever we are producing, it needs to be usable for people. And let's say if you're managing a database, different teams are using this database to be able to actually use it properly. Because if it's slow, laggy, and they are afraid of the use of this database, it doesn't really make sense. And I also was thinking in the open source world, open source projects, how are the communications are handled? Because that is also another aspect of maintaining something. Because again, to be able to have maintainers and contributors, you need to be appealing to those people that are new to the project. And I see that sometimes, some comments can be very demotivating to the people in the emailing list and the channels, external and internal, when they build together, there's also, you can see the tracks of the communication. And you can see that some people, we are losing people in some projects and we don't recognize their effort as well and so on. So it also impacts, I think, the longevity of the whole project. And let's say a person who is a core team is managing something and one of them decided to take a leave or retire or something. Will this project continue? And if there's not enough people to repair stuff, that affects the longevity. And let's say we have encountered issues, like how do you communicate those issues? Let's say some people open a, GitHub issue or something to your project. Do you actually take care of it? Do you triage them well? Do you reply people nicely? Do you give them some roadmap? Do you have a plan ahead to actually do these repairs? So I think, having the proper documentation, having the practices set, and make sure that what you document is actually specific to what you do. If you are documenting your API, you should mention your endpoints, parameters, error codes and so on, and probably automate those things so that you can't really manually do these things anymore, hopefully. And also the human involvement aspect that is important, which is also probably comes with the main communication thing in general.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app soon. That's interesting. You covered a pretty wide range of different types of projects and different types of scenarios and things that thinking about community with open source projects that you might be involved in, or how, you're working on some internal application and trying to just onboard people is a challenging thing to kind of get right. But then I always think about, how do you think about providing the right kind of documentation for different types of people that are also going to work on a project? Because I know that some people do really appreciate really thorough documentation, and there's other people that will skip reading documentation and want to go straight to the code. You mentioned code comments and things like that, but I'm also curious a little bit around what your thoughts are when it comes to particular databases. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast was to talk, you mentioned you don't necessarily do a ton of software development itself per se, but you do a lot of work within and around database stuff. So what do you think makes a well-maintained database for let's say a typical private company or application, assuming there's an application involved?
Yeah, the documentation topic, as you brought up, it depends on the people who will probably use it, as you say, because a developer persona probably doesn't need a user manual to how to add a record, how to create how to do a query or something. But let's say maybe marketing department or analytics department, they are actually doing different type of reporting queries, and they need a different type of information available. So I think knowing who will be using this documentation, that is a start probably, and then you can add based on that. And in terms of when I think of a database well managed, because I started working with databases a long time ago, and I have a very bad story of how not to onboard new people, or what is not a good database management. So I started with a company that is the biggest kind of hospital in Turkey. The tech department of it is an individual place, and they were on Oracle, and there was the logic of all this information with data, customer, patients, and all their health related stuff. And I think the apps only just query those things, and they didn't really do much about it. And the logic how these things are queried and everything was on the stored procedures. They were pages long and thousands of columns. And I just started, just freshly out of college, and it was my last internship, took 6 months or something. And I think I spent the first month reading what type of columns, why are these things connected? It doesn't seem to be connected. And there is kind of graveyard of columns that nobody touches, nobody removes, and nobody knows what to do with them. But like to be able to understand, like to add something or edit value or anything that to do, you need to know, is it used? And like, how can you test that it's being used? So there are like tools, of course, to, see which queries are running and so on. But I was in they called me at that time as like SQL developer. So I was writing report queries. But then you have no control over it. Like, how does the performance affect it? And like, it might be related to I was just starting, so they didn't give me a lot of flexibility to do those things. But I was so afraid, basically, and it shouldn't be something you're afraid if you want to develop something. And when you ask, the columns mean nothing, table means nothing. There's like endless numbers added to each other, and then like, what is this even like? How do you find the patient's name? How do you find somebody's like, which branch of hospital is operating what? And so it just takes to read all these queries written, and somebody kind of shows you. But it shouldn't be that way. I mean, I'm imagining having somebody joining like this and spending a month is super ineffective. And then I worked in a bank. It was another story there. You have to probably all the queries that we made was audited and recorded. So you were getting calls sometimes from like security teams, like, why did you query this table 3 times today? Yeah, and I'm working on the feature that we will have to have this, deployment upcoming. So for that feature, I need to test it. And that's the only thing that you can do. It was a DB2 database. It was and then, I remember those days, and those were definitely not how a database, I think, should look, or people should interact with the databases. But then let's come to the better parts when I actually met Postgres, and that I felt, whoa, databases doesn't need to be actually scary. You can actually manage them, you can configure them, you can see what's happening, and the documentation, because when I think about it, the first thing came to my mind was documentation, because Postgres, I think, has probably one of the best documentations in all the open source projects. I still, to this day, whenever I kind of need to refresh something or then follow something, I go to the documentation itself as my main source of truth. And I didn't need to really go to the Postgres code to go through everything, as in like DBA, as a sysadmin, as a builder on like database cloud projects on top of it. So I think Postgres itself, just starting with it, was really, really welcoming to me as a relatively new person who just knows SQL.
Interesting you bring up that story about working in an Oracle environment. Was there a specific role in that organization, like a DBA or multiple DBAs that were responsible for a lot of the general upkeep and direction of the database, the Oracle databases that you had, and then you would be working on, did you have to interact with the DBA back in that area, or is it just the developers all kind of navigating that themselves? Your SQL developers.
Yeah, exactly. So we were a room of SQL developers, and sitting in the whole room of people, we are doing the reporting, basically. I never knew who manages these databases, where are they living, we were just like isolated, and yeah.
That's interesting. Because it correlates, or it reminds me of one of my first professional, I'm air quoting, programming jobs, where we had a Microsoft SQL Server, and because we had like an Access application that interacted with it, and then we built there were some web applications that were ASP and ASP.NET when that came out. But almost everything that was like business logic lived in the database. You created your stored procedures and you iterated on those, and you had your shared objects and all those other things as well. But we had a DBA that was in a cubicle down the hall, and if you wanted a new column, you had to ask them to see if that would be something, and they'd be like, well, maybe you could use it this other one, but I don't remember having a lot of conversations about removing columns, because that's definitely an important thing. So it goes back to the maintainability thing around, like, that can be a challenge. And then when I started using Postgres a couple of years into my professional journey, I worked at a company where the owner of the company wrote the O'Reilly book for PostgreSQL, and we were creating everything in the database then too, lots of stored procedures in the database, but we could do it sometimes with different programming languages, which was super exciting, because I didn't particularly love working with just raw SQL all the time. But to be able to use Perl or Python in the database to write your scripts, and also Ruby and PHP. And that was kind of an interesting paradigm. But then I feel like the market kind of moved to, let's move more of that into the application layer and maybe a little bit less in the database. But what's your experience been during that time? Are you still working a lot with projects that are doing a lot of things in the database, or now the database is more of a lot of tables and you've got your ORMs or other sort of clients server or client applications that are doing more of the business logic and the application side of things?
I think we probably worked at a similar time in the similar sphere. So I felt like when I started with this, like all these banks and insurance companies and everything, hospitals, they all had the logic in this stored procedures that we were writing. And it was like almost everything. And eventually it's kind of shifted off. I don't see anymore. I think it's even kind of considered now as a best practice to have all the logic in the database and just keep the necessary things there and don't like overdo all this. I think when I switched to Postgres, it kind of, for us, it is different. Like I was using like tables and views and everything. So people could actually interact with Postgres much easier. So and I moved out of this like SQL Server, Oracle, and DB2, all of those databases. I didn't really need to have the store procedure logic as much. So because I think the operating of when I switch from writing SQL queries for those to operating side of the Postgres, because it kind of allows you to be the DBA. And I was the person, as you said, like people were coming to me to add a constraint, add a column, and so on. And those were the days that you had this one person for one DB, right? Like I was managing all this e-commerce and now eventually what happened, right? So we had this like store procedures kind of logic there. And then we moved to this like normal using database with like through the app and the people who use ORMs or not, right? Or they manage it themselves. And now like eventually, right? I don't think that many companies anymore have dedicated DBAs. And it's kind of all abstract that way, like we have the managed services now. And even if there's a DBA, it doesn't do the stuff that we were doing back then, right? Installing the databases and planning the space and getting the actual machines and going to do, like those things. No, I don't think it's anymore. You just plan a click, right? This instance type I want to use IOPS and I don't know. So it's like, it is changing. And actually I wanted to today even mention that because seeing all these trends and why probably one person can do much more now, because then we learned how to make things more automated. And let's say, take the example of schema migration, how we were doing back then, right? Adding something like changing a column type or constraint. So we were all having this maintenance plans, right? Have a time to do all these things. 3 a.m. ideally, the teams get together, somebody's changing the application. We are pointing to PG bouncer to this app and then that app. It was all like really script by script managed very sort of manually in a way. But now we can plan it ahead and do these things easily. And the current company that I work on has even like an open source tool for it. We call it Pgvector. So you can avoid downtime risk. And so you can actually do these things, not necessarily having a maintenance window. And the tools like, this, what was it, infrastructure as a code thing when it came, it was so huge. And it actually made me move from a DBA, just standard DBA, to a DBA with a tool belt. So I could actually write a few YAML files, done. So deploy 50 databases for 50 different customers and using the similar template and playbook. And then I can add all these things. And I spent, I think, maybe 5-6 years writing those automating tools at that point, switched to writing those tools instead of actually writing SQL queries or tuning individual databases with scripts. So I just wrote YAML and Python instead and could actually remotely manage all these customers that we were having.
We'll be back with our interview with Gulcin in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to Maintainable. If you're finding these conversations valuable, are you even listening? Please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone who you think I should have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to Robbie with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, back to our interview with Gulcin, Yildirim, Jelinek. One of the things I wanted to also dig into with you was in one of your recent blog posts, you discussed Pgvector, which is an extension that enables Postgres to function as a vector database. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about this. So for those unfamiliar with vector databases, maybe we could explain what makes them different from a air quoting traditional database, and what new possibilities does Pgvector open up for developers working with Postgres?
It's really good that you brought Pgvector because it was like for the last year, it was really my kind of obsession. What I liked about Postgres, when I started Postgres, like, 2012 or something, I never switched back because I was like, wow, I can literally do anything with this database that is within the limits of any technical thinking that I might have. The extensibility aspect of it, as you said, like having different languages to be able to query or do things with the database is not just dealing with SQL, which was something, right? It allows people to develop in whatever language they want, if they want to write these procedures in the language that they know. The same way that we can extend Postgres, like, for example, before logical replication be part of the Postgres core, it was an extension. So you could extend Postgres. At that time, Postgres only had the physical streaming replication, let's say. And to be able to maybe you do a logical replication, you had an extension called pglogical. And then that extension allowed you to have a database that can actually do logical replication. And to me, this was fascinating. And the same thing happened recently with the Pgvector, because we were having at previous company that I was working, people were like really, AI boom kind of became really accessible to everybody. People were like discovering what is this model doing, what is LLM doing, what is a vector, and so on. And I noticed, okay, we have Postgres, and then Pgvector project really allowed Postgres to be a vector database. And it was like simple as that. You can have, so what is the difference maybe, having Postgres as a, why it is different now? Because Postgres in core doesn't have the vector data type itself. It's a new data type. And when you have this extension, usually with any type of extension, it is focused on one type of problem, and it comes with its own data types, it comes with its own functions, and it comes with different index types, even so you can have different index types, even like, I don't know, different ways of accessing let's say table access methods. You can have different kind of methods to access your data through any like extension as well. So this allows that when you install Pgvector, it brings this vector data type to Postgres, and it also allows you so that you can actually store your vectors, query them, and then index them if you like, and you actually make a standard database that you have all your data, and now a store for vectors as well. And that's fascinating. And when before people like, what's a vector? We all know what's a vector. Actually, it's just like numbers. And if you want to, let's say, store a PDF, you have to go through this PDF document and create something that is called embeddings. And embeddings are actually the vectors. That what makes embeddings is that you run this like a, let's say, PDF or image or video, whatever the data source you have, and generate something in the form of vectors, as we call. And these LLMs are responsible from this. There are different type of models for different type of purposes. And then you can store all this data in a way that, convert this data to something we call vectors in multiple dimensional space. So if you have, let's say, I don't know, X and Y axis, everybody thinks of it is very easily like, you have 2 dimensions. There's a point there. So you have like 2 dimensions with 1 point, X and Y. And if you have vectors, it's like high dimensional data. It stores all this and a semantical way of storing this information about this data, which means lots of multiple points around this vectorial space that we have. And what usually these databases offer, if they are specialized for this, they calculate the distance between the points. Let's say you have a query, and that query needs to be mapped to a way in this vectorial space so that you can actually query different things closest to this query space. And then if they are very relevant to each other, they are closer in distance. If they are not related to each other, they are kind of further from each other. And this whole, what actually is called vector similarity search, really like you just do the distance search. And that allowed Postgres to be a vector database, and pretty good at it, to be honest. It started as like, okay, there are like specialized vector databases. Why would I need to use Postgres even? Is there even a need to use Postgres? There is, because we noticed people who are using Postgres already, they don't want to have another dedicated database to, put things in and out. They need to learn another thing maybe, and it might be not even the best performance for their use case. And also what I notice, people rarely, at least the people that I talk with and the customers and people that I know, rarely use only vector queries, because they still have their own database operations and they want to combine what data they have with this new vector data type. So ideally, what I see in the future of Postgres, that we can actually make this, let's say, indexing of this kind of queries, that you can use vector indexes that comes with this vector data type and Pgvector, and also, let's say, full text search doing with it. So hybrid searches, hybrid indexes. So there are a lot to do, how to do the quantization, how can you do, more efficiently. Building these indexes takes time and stuff. So it never stops giving, basically. Like when you learn Postgres, it's just like, oh, now I have a vector database knowledge. And before it was like when JSON came to Postgres, it was a big thing, You remember probably. And it's like, yeah, I like that.
I think one of the things that's interesting about that type of scenario where you might have a traditional database in Postgres and you want to maybe put vectors in there as well. Is there I think one of the arguments that I hear people talk about, like maybe separating things out, is worrying that you might have a weird performance issue. Like, how do you optimize it for both of those scenarios versus if there are 2 different places, different things, then different types of queries are not kind of impacting each other if you're sharing the same CPU, type of resources and stuff like that. Is that something that you see actually being an issue, or is that just kind of not really a thing?
No, I understand what you mean, because when you think of databases, like the first question comes to mind, what type of workload you have? Is it an OLTP workload? Is it an OLAP workload? Because now we have this trend now, this analytic queries coming to Postgres. I mean, it was already part of it, but how to do analytical workloads better with the columnar and then this new iceberg format and so on. So there are this way of working and thinking of databases, but I rarely seen people complaining, especially now. I think not many people had already write AI type of workloads. So currently, I think people are still discovering what can I do with this data. I want to have a chatbot type of thing. I want to put all my Jira. I don't know. I want to put all my repositories and documents and presentations and able to do search with it. So currently, if they are not already specialized doing AI type of work before, people are just thinking the ways how they can reuse and repurpose their data and kind of improve their product space. So for that regard, I don't think we are in a state that we will see people, with conflicting workloads. And I don't think it will be, my belief is that people will still do what they do for most of the time for their business logic and add this type of thing as a side. And there are ways to optimize that. That's a beauty, I think, for Postgres. You don't need to give up your, let's say, the other configuration tuning that you made this specially for these queries, because you can still tune, like, I don't know, generic, like how do you manage your Postgres, right? How do you do the maintenance, how many workers you run, how is your memory settings, and so on. But also you can actually specially help with this type of queries differently. So there are like ways to optimize, let's say with new vector indexes, you can set special settings to make those actually work faster so it doesn't block. There are ways to consider things like database level for whole the system workload, and also for the workloads that you will use or queries that you will use. So I don't think it's like in a conflict.
Another thing, I come from a space of primarily more web development, and a kind of a thing that's been coming up. I don't know if you know much about or have much of an opinion on this, but I'm curious. For a long time, we've relied on other types of key value storage for, say, caching content that we're getting from the database, so we don't have to talk to the database quite as often, or we don't want the database necessarily to be a bottleneck for one way or another. And so now there's been a little bit of a trend to like, well, why don't we move the caching into the databases as well? And it's like this interesting, like, are you seeing that there are ways that can be done well with different types of Postgres extensions that are, I haven't really researched this particular thing, but I know that there's people that are like, maybe we can get rid of Redis or Memcache and just do this in the database as well. But I'm like, are we not just interacting with the same database? How are we able to do this effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really focus on this part of the workloads, like how to remove Redis or Memcache or something. But I think like the trend, like not maybe the trend, but nowadays, right, things are much cheaper, right? We didn't need to, resources became more available for many people, and maybe apps became less, we are not running giant apps anymore. We have these microservices. And so it kind of makes the distribution of things a bit easier in a way. So I don't see anymore like this, one app, one database, everything is just growing, what is it, like horizontally? No, vertically. I always confuse this as like. But basically, I think that kind of changed the shift. So we have more modern tools around, so we can actually use the resources that we have. And in terms of Postgres, I think we can also explore the scalability aspect of it. So when do you need to write stuff to if you are creating some distributing the masters, for example, that can actually help other people to solve some problems, or read scalability could be now much more easier, right? You don't need to really have the physical database, the server to add. It's now I can just scale up and down much easier. Most of the cloud providers allow it. So maybe in that regard, it's probably better now, but I didn't really explore how to.
It's interesting to, one of the other things I was curious about was it was interesting to read about your view on the role of YAML in DevOps, especially someone who's been working with databases for a long time before infrastructure as code was a common practice. How do you see YAML fitting into the bigger picture of DevOps and database management? And what do you enjoy about working with it?
Yeah, it made me be part of this, I think, with this DevOps philosophy when it came around. I never thought that I will be actually stopping managing databases, like in a way that I managed before. And it allows somebody who doesn't really was the kind of developer, let's say, I didn't have this developer head at all. I was just writing SQL, so I was like SQL developer, and I was managing databases, so I was a DBA. But what YAML allowed me that I could actually develop what I need to keep the systems intact. And I was working in a company called Second Quadrant when I first, met YAML and Ansible. We had like hundreds of customers, and I was working as a remote DBA. So we were able to, over the clock, all around the world support type of thing. And we were able to install and scale at their replicas, configure them, tune it, and solve all their problems. And so if you really need to have that many customers with maybe, 50 people working maximum in a company, it's impossible. So you have to really, to scale it, it allowed me to actually, we noticed that like everybody needs some sort of tuning for this type of workload. So you have to just run a script, learn their data, and then you recommend an architecture to these people that they can be good for their use case. And I worked in a project called Trusted Postgres Architect. It is actually open source now, and it's GPL3, so you could reuse it. So at that time, it was kind of how we did it. We just make people provision those instances and deploy the way that we recommend Postgres to be used for them. And they can just change few lines of YAML and add a replica. Few changes of in a line of something, and then add a backup strategy. And otherwise you will need these companies wouldn't need anymore a DBA. Maybe one person, if there's a huge company, like let's say 5,000 people company, there were like teams of database people, teams of database engineers, and they didn't need anymore because these tools actually allow them to just operate the tooling to actually make sure things are working. They don't need to worry about, they didn't necessarily need to have this knowledge. And we had the knowledge, and I had it as a person or a team, we had this knowledge, and YAML allowed us to actually manage this thing without actually being there.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. I want to take a moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Picture us as that specialty coffee roaster down the street for your software projects, where legacy applications are brewed to perfection, just like a finely crafted cup. Whether your project needs a quick shot of expertise, like an espresso with staff augmentation, or the smoother, balanced support of a flat white with fractional development services, we've got the right blend for every need. We specialize in technologies like Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel. So if you know of a company that's dealing with technical debt as bitter as an overpulled shot, or needs a fresh infusion of features, send them our way. We'll work with them to find the ideal brew, from a bold cortado to a frothy cappuccino, tailored to keep their software robust and modern. Check us out at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. And remember, the perfect software blend is just a pour away. Do you find that something specific about YAML versus, is it the simplicity and how approachable it is, maybe more consistent than maybe digging into every open source project's config file format and their style of how they approach things, like how you configure? I just remember logging into Linux servers all the time and having to edit some conf files and being like, are we versioning this stuff sometimes? Maybe, I don't know. And then let's see what happens when I change this, cross your fingers. So, and then being worried that you had like a syntax thing. But yeah, I think it's interesting thinking about how YAML has made such a big impact on the community of software development in the last couple of decades. I appreciate it too. I also know a couple of things I want to kind of check in with you on as well. I know that you've been involved in some exciting projects and communities, including the Prague PostgreSQL Meetup and the Diva conference. Can you share a little bit about your experiences with these communities and how they've shaped or inspired your own work?
Oh, yeah, thank you. And I think I'm part of Postgres community very long time already. And that's partly because when I joined, I felt really welcomed, and I wanted to have this feeling for other people who joined Postgres. So we have in Europe foundation Postgres Europe that is non-profit, and I was bored of it. That's how I actually started organizing conferences in different countries and so on. And there are, I think, we don't really see what it goes to running a community and a project, and people are kind of, maybe it's a good thing they don't see or notice, because then some people are actually doing those work too. There was a year I just kept writing visa letters for people so that they can fly to Europe, let's say. So this kind of things. And I'm still associated with Postgres Europe, and we have this new lively formed diversity committee that I'm working, and I'm running Prague Postgres Meetup because I happen to live here for the last 7 years. And in Turkey, because I'm from Turkey, Diva is a conference that we are doing as Women Developers of Turkey, Kadın Yazılımcı. It will be the third year next year. The opening is like Diva is like dive into AI. But it's not only AI that we are focusing, we are trying to change how conferences are made. I don't know if you've seen, but when you go to a tech conference, there are things that you expect to have, right? Maybe multiple sessions and the schedules and so on, but you don't really expect a sign translator to be there in the venue. And it's like, because we don't really see disabled people, or we don't really concern ourselves with accessibility unless maybe we are one of those accessibility needing person. And I think if we plan now at this age, this year, we should plan for disabilities and accessibility issues. And that's what we are trying to change. We are trying to make sure like people who are kind of not able to be part of these conferences should be part of it. And accessibility shouldn't be a second thought. It should start from the planning. It should reflect on the website. It should be, an assistance for when you register a conference. You should be asked for it. And having a signed translator is not so hard. I mean, we are thinking of catering, but even catering is not inclusive. I mean, it is a new thing that we are actually asking people, do you have any issues with this kind of food or something? And yeah, I think that's what I really actually want to focus on when I'm part of a community, that making sure it should be available to everybody.
That's wonderful. I'll definitely include links to those in the show notes for people as well. And I'm curious, is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if everybody will be interested, but I really liked a book called Kirke. It's written Circe. It is like Greek mythology inspired book. And there's this new kind of genre that I found that, the women goddesses and women generally in mythology, we hear them from another perspective, usually from a man's perspective. And this new genre with people that I'm reading now, and they write it in a way that now we can read through the women's perspective. And it really makes mythology fun for me. It's like kind of fantastical books, and, it's not like a factual book, but it's based on the mythological characters. And so I read Kirke and I really enjoyed it, how it approached, feminism in the mythology. I like to see a strong character. And now I'm reading Elektra in the similar genre. It's also, when I need to escape stuff, so I read this type of books now. Thank you for asking. It's a different thing.
Yeah, I'll definitely include links for the listeners in the show notes so they can check these books out. And with that, where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering or databases online?
I'm really irregular with my blogs because I never kept the personal blogs. I moved to company. I like writing, but some of all distributed within different company blogs. Yeah, currently I write in Zeta blog, in the company blog, and they kind of let me be myself. I'm like personal, almost like a personal blog, so I enjoy writing. And I go to podcasts from time to time. So, and also give a lot of talks in different conferences. I have like this European conference that I join regularly, and luckily I'm getting accepted. So yeah, if you just write my name, I'm also on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. I don't know for how long. But yeah. If people want to search my name, a pathetic magpie, a different nickname from teenager years, they can find me.
Well, great. I'll include all the social links that I can track down for everybody. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Gulcin. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you, Robbie.
Maintainable.